Researching your ancestry is popular these days, and TV shows such as Finding Your Roots and Who Do You Think You Are draw in viewers by looking into the family histories of movie stars and other celebrities. Researching your own past can be exciting even for us average people if your ancestors were adventurers or friends of the mighty and the famous. It can also be painful if they played a role in the darker side of history. It was the latter that drove journalist Chris Tomlinson to look into his Texas family's history. He writes about his experiences in the book Tomlinson Hill, the remarkable story of two families who share the Tomlinson name, one white and one black.
I first learned as a child about the fact that there were black Tomlinsons as well as white Tomlinsons, and that we were united by a shared history on a slave plantation in central Texas. As an adult, I learned more about bigotry and prejudice as a war correspondent, and I thought it was time for me to examine my own history, my own family's history of ethnic violence and the things that they did.
Tomlinson says that slave ownership before the Civil War was justified by the Southern aristocracy myth that was perpetuated by his family and community while he was growing up. It was easy and even romantic in a way to believe that your ancestors were benevolent plantation owners than to face reality.
I think the myth of Southern aristocracy is perpetuated by Gone with the Wind, this idea of a noble upper class in the South that was somehow defending a way of life that was honorable, or that the Civil War really wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights. When you grow up in the South, being able to associate yourself with Scarlett O'Hara and Rhett Butler is something that's encouraged, it's rewarded. And so when I found out that my family held slaves, I kind of felt that way, and the people around me supported that.
Tomlinson started the journey into his family's Tomlinson Hill history with a visit to his father.
He had the collection of newspaper clippings that the family had collected about the family history. It was mostly obituaries, some marriage announcements, and a chance to kind of start there, figure out who the people are that are involved. I then went to the county courthouse and went through 160 years of records. I used Ancestry.com to build family trees for myself and the black Tomlinsons.
Tomlinson says that the idea of the good slaveholder that he grew up with was quickly put to rest by evidence he found in letters and stories that were published in those old newspapers.
I still have people today who come up to me and say, yes, my family owned slaves, but they were good slaveholders. And the truth is, when you look at what is involved in forcing labor from someone that you're holding in bondage, that violence is the only way to do that. And I found diaries and I found letters where my ancestors talked about beating slaves and the importance of beating slaves on a regular basis to maintain authority. Newspaper editors wrote about the curse of the slaveholder who didn't beat their slaves, that this was somehow undermining the institution. So I think my ancestors were fairly typical. They used violence. They sexually exploited the female slaves. Once I knew the facts and saw what they did and what they talked about doing, there was no such thing as a good slaveholder, and that was one of the biggest myths that I felt like I needed to dispel.
After the Civil War, Tomlinson says that slaves in Texas were led to believe they should not move elsewhere, but stay put on their former owners' farms and negotiate contracts to become sharecroppers. This life, he found out, was just slavery by another name.
The political power, the economic power, still laid in Texas with the people who had owned the slaves, who'd operated the plantations. And so they developed a system of sharing the crop that meant that the former slaves were just as dependent and just as subject to abuse as they had ever been as slaves. Only now the landowner had no obligation to care for the sharecroppers because there was no financial investment in them as individuals. So when I read accounts of former slaves, many of them said that slavery was nothing compared to what they suffered as sharecroppers.
He says that sharecropping was structured to keep workers from ever getting out from under the plantation's power. The landowner's contract with a black family required the workers to get everything they needed, seeds, tools, clothing, and food, from a particular store. The shop would keep an account of the debt owed by the worker.
At the end of the year, when the harvest came in, the first 2/3 of the crop would go to the landowner, and that would be their profit. The last third would go to the sharecropper, and that was usually the worst quality of the crop that year. That third would be sold, and there would be a balancing of accounts. Now, the whites were the only ones who kept the accounts, and inevitably, the black family would discover that they were either in debt or had just broken even. And if they were in debt, they were obligated to work for that same white family for the following year. And that's the way that the landowner was able to maintain control over the black sharecropper.
After the Civil War, Tomlinson says former slaves built what were called freedom colonies on the outskirts of white communities. They weren't acknowledged by the white authorities and remained pretty autonomous, with their own businesses, churches, schools, and way of life.
They tried to be as self-sufficient as possible. One of the black Tomlinsons I spoke to, who's now 89 years old, talked about what a wonderful community it was. One of my contemporaries, LaDainian Tomlinson, the former football player for the San Diego Chargers, he describes the freedom colony known as Tomlinson Hill as a place where he could go into anyone's house at any time, and they never had any fear, and everyone knew each other. And this was where they formed Masons lodges and fraternal organizations to educate themselves, to build capital, to build businesses, and to hopefully escape as much oppression as they could.
Chris Tomlinson's grandfather, Tommy, was a bigot and probably a member of the Ku Klux Klan during its heyday in the 1920s. He says that Tommy showed what could happen to a child who was brought up in a racist environment and influenced by the Klan.
He'd just grown up with that old-fashioned belief that black people were simply inferior, that they were almost another species, and that they couldn't be trusted and they couldn't be relied upon. And that was the world that he grew up in, and that's what he believed until his death in the 1970s.
His father, Bob Tomlinson, was brought up in this kind of household, but the author said it had a very different effect on him.
My father, on the other hand, grew up in Dallas, and he grew up hearing these things from his grandfather, but it was the 1950s. It was the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, and my father realized that my grandfather was just wrong, and he broke the chain of racism in the family and would later become a member of a couple of civil rights groups in Dallas.
When Chris Tomlinson talked with the black Tomlinsons, did he notice any resentment towards the way they were treated by the white Tomlinsons? He said he met Lori Ann, LaDainian Tomlinson's mother, who was comfortable talking about the family and very gracious to him. The only inkling of resentment came from Charles, an older member of the family.
Sometimes when he talked about being a sharecropper as a child and the white Tomlinsons coming and telling his father that he wasn't farming enough cotton and that he wasn't working hard enough, there was some resentment in his voice.
Some of the younger members of the black Tomlinsons were a bit reticent and happier to let the slaveholder and sharecropper days remain in the past.
They really didn't want to know if my family had abused their ancestors. So there's still an emotional rawness to these things. But the way I found to overcome that was to be open and truthful and ready to discuss what happened in a very objective way. And once they understood that I wasn't there to perpetuate the myth of Southern aristocracy or to somehow pretend that my ancestors did nothing wrong, we were able to have a really honest and good conversation. And I'm proud to say that we consider ourselves part of the same family.
To learn more about this topic and our guest, Chris Tomlinson, head to viewpointsradio.org. The story originally aired in February 2015 and was written by producer Pat Reuter. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. Our studio manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Gary Price.